I am so happy to have Nate here with me today to help me dissect this section from 21 to 31 of the psychedelic conversation. We're going to be looking at it primarily through the lens of the Trinity that both of these guys are chasing and trying to understand. And Nate made the comment that this is probably the 9 most dense minutes of conversation on the internet. So it's the conversation in the discussion between Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke on cognition and consciousness. And Nate, I'm going to let you start because I know you have some ideas about this very beginning part, and then we'll follow on from there.
Yes.
I do have a transcript, so if there's at some point you want me to use the actual language of what they said.
I did take some notes on the part that I was really in particular wanting to discuss, which I'm still trying to work through because so Peterson, he drops this idea. He says, and I changed the language. This isn't the exact word for word. So you have the transcript. So if I get something wrong, let me know. But this is what I have. He says, imagine we are holographic in relationship to this distributed cognitive net. The part contains some of the whole, and the whole would be this distributed spirit that you are describing, at least as it's enacted, insofar as you are holographic, minuscule, but complete in some sense kenotic representation of the spirit. You can ask it to bestow its wisdom on you, and its operation in your unconscious produces the revelatory thought. So that is like, and he doesn't explain what he means at all. And there is a lot going on there.
Yeah, I find it very interesting that that John Vervaeke didn't ask.
Right.
He just acted though. Yeah, of course.
Right. So I'm going to start with the part that I think that I understand, and then I'm going to work back to this holographic part that I'm still working.
Let's back it up just a little bit because I think there's an important thing just before that. So at the very beginning, Jordan says, I imagine the soul flight practices are the same thing as the Eleusinian mystery. They're a continuation of the shamanic practices into the present. And Vervaeke says, what's interesting to me is that Plato represents Socrates as being able to bring about that state into people by dialogue alone. Peterson, I know what that means, and so do you. Vervaeke, when I see people in these practices, they first orient on each other, then on the logos, and then find an intimacy in the logos. And Peterson says, what do you mean by that? Vervaeke says, they come to find that they are not only in relationship to each other, but to this Geist or logos that is happening in the distributed cognition. And at that point, Peterson says, that's a very interesting phrasing. That's what I see as the spirit that's guiding the golden thread.
Right.
And that's what you're praying to when you ask for a revelatory thought when you're confused. Imagine that we are holographic in relation to this distributed cognitive net. So the part contains some of the whole, and the whole would be this distributed spirit. Insofar as you are this minuscule, complete, kenotic representation of this spirit, you can ask it to bestow its wisdom in you, and its operation in your unconscious within you is this revelatory thought. So before you start in on the holographic thing, let's go back to the thing where he says, I see this as the spirit that's guiding the golden thread. I know you did a little research on the golden thread. What did you come up with?
Well, the idea of the golden thread is it is like deeply embedded in a lot of like mythology. Essentially, like I would say it maps onto Telos. This is what he's talking about. It's like the golden thread like represents your purpose. So what he's suggesting is that this like ancestral collective spirit that he wants to map onto God the Father, he says at one point too, like somehow it's like it's this idea of God the Father, which he's still trying to psychologize because that's his lens, that lays down the golden thread. So and it seems to me it's like what they seem to be talking about in this seems to me to be like describing trying to describe like what a Christ-like mode of existence actually is in terms of a pattern of being, because it's one that is kenotic in relation to this God the Father idea. That so that which is kenotic to God the Father, which that which has no I am to predicate, that is not derived from relationship to this telotic God the Father idea that he's talking about.
Okay, so one thing I want to lay down here is in a lot of Jordan Peterson's not sermons. I'm not sure if it was in the biblical.
They kind of are sermons, though.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was in the biblical series or if it was in one of his college lectures, but he talks about that thing that shimmers out in front of you that is basically, he describes it as your future calling you forward.
Right.
That, I think that's what he means when he talks about the golden thread.
Yeah, I think what he was effectively saying is that like he sees Christianity as like psychologically true, like as a description of like what goes on within the human psyche. He thinks it's describing the case. What he's unsure about is whether that maps onto reality.
Yeah.
And which is why he wonders so much about whether there is any reality beyond consciousness. If he is able to get to a place where he can answer that question in the affirmative, is that like consciousness is the ground of reality, then he has his answer.
Well, I know John Vervaeke says he's been talking a lot with Bernardo Kastrup.
Right.
And Bernardo Kastrup says that there really isn't anything besides consciousness. So, but I mean, John also said that he didn't agree with Kastrup. So, so Michael, why don't you jump in here?
I'm still catching up to speed with where you guys are at.
We're just talking about the golden thread that leads into the section on holographic in relation to distributed cognitive net, which I think we can, if maybe we can bypass the golden thread thing and move right on to the holographic thing. Or did you have something else to say about golden thread, Nate?
I just think that like if you take like, so like, I mean, it's like you can think of like the thread of one's fate, like in Norse mythology that the Norns lay out. You have like the thread that leads Theseus through the labyrinth. There are like all these mythological like symbolic language that connects like the idea of this golden thread to both meaning and purpose, and I would say ultimately to Telos, like that there's like, and that's, I think that's exactly what he's saying. He's like the God the Father. He connects God the Father to memory, which is interesting too, because because in Saint Augustine's analogy of the Trinity, memory is one of the components of like memory, understanding, and will are the components of like the analogy he uses to explain how the Trinity, the Trinity's threeness and oneness, because like the memory, understanding, and will like are all operations of the same thing, even though they're different aspects of it.
Well, the thing about the golden thread, I've had several episodes on my channel where we've talked deeply about the golden thread idea, because when Jordan Peterson talks about this little thing that glimmers out in front of you, he identifies it as your interest. What is guiding your interests? Now, maybe theoretically it could be the ancestral distributed cognitive net that's come down to us through history that is guiding my particular interest, but it seems much deeper to me than that.
Well, he suggests it's much deeper than that too, because he says it's the part of this, and he's not sure whether he wants to map, he's not entirely sure whether he wants to map it on to God the Father or if he wants to wrap it onto the Spirit, right? He hesitates as to which he wants to map it onto, and he also suggests that a part of that is in you. Like that's what he's talking about, like later on when he moves into like there's this minuscule part of the whole. So he's talking, I think it probably, if we want to understand this, I think it probably maps on closer to the Spirit, in my opinion. And actually, the whole thing he's talking about seems to map on better to the spirit to me. So
Yeah,
what
they
he's
come to
talking
that
about,
conclusion eventually, I think. Yeah.
right? Yeah. So he's talking about like that part of the spirit, which is really, I mean, it's the hidden divine feminine that exists within you. Like that's what it is, and like that's what's calling you toward union with God. Like, and that's why you have like that's why you have all those sexual union metaphors throughout scripture, because the divine within us is feminine in relation to like the God the Father masculine within God. And that
Right of Christ, right?
and right, and the whole right, and the Holy Spirit is like, I think, like symbolically feminine as well, which is why it's the Holy Spirit that is sent to dwell amongst us, because that is like the part, it's that feminine part of God that God is calling back to himself.
Well, but I think there's something even more particular in this idea of the thread that glimmers out in front of, because it's a different thread for each person.
Right.
And it's
Yes.
highly idiosyncratic according to not only what already exists in me according to my experiential DNA, which I've never found a better word for than that, that makes all of my connections with the world, but it's also, however, my purpose will be lived out in reality as it is right now, and as it moves forward into future history with other people, so that my purpose is supporting the people around me, and also supporting, kind of like, we always say we stand on the shoulders of giants, but there have to be some shoulders in the past for us to stand on. Right. So we have to be some shoulders for the future to stand on. There's this.
Well, that's right. That's why I think so these individual strands, like I think that when you're in a more proper spiritual orientation, I think you start to see these strands as crossing over and interwoven and forming more of a net.
Yes.
And it's not really just this straight cord, between you and the divine. It's like all these threads cross one another to form a net, an interconnected net.
Yeah, I mean, you probably I don't know how many people are going to slog through my lecture that I gave on art and how all these interconnections work, but that's exactly what I see as these sliding interconnections that allow for ultimate flexibility and ultimate possibility and ultimate variability. That's why there's so much beauty. I mean, it's just anyway, I have to find a better way to describe it, because it took me 2 hours in the lecture, and it probably could be boiled down into one sentence.
Do you have a video of that, Karen?
What?
Was there video made of that lecture or not?
Yes, there was. Yes, it's okay. They haven't promoted it at all. The funny thing is, this is hilarious. The first thing the guy says to me before we started the video is, he says, I'm just captivated by those paintings that you made of reflections on glass. And I said, which paintings would those be? And he says, well, there were some with glass, and then there were some ice cubes. And I said, oh, you're talking about Sherry Harkins. She does these amazing paintings of ice cubes, and she interviewed me on her channel, but you're talking about her paintings. So inside I'm thinking, maybe they thought they were getting Sherry Harkins. Oh. So instead they get me with my long presentation. But anyway, I told them, I said, yes, because Sherry really sees. When she looks at an ice cube, she really sees. This is that holographic thing, right? I said, when you get to the place that you can see a universe in an ice cube, that's when you're really seeing. And that's what an artist is someone who really learns to see. And that doesn't, and I don't mean, when I use the word artist, I mean a person who is indwelt by Christ, because that's everyone who is indwelt by Christ learns to, because of the Spirit, we learn to see things with those kinds of eyes, that we can see all of his beauty in every single thing that we look at.
Right. I read somewhere recently, like I found a quote, like someone said that creativity and spirituality are the same thing. Like
Well,
that's
not
which is
spirituality. I don't like that word.
well, that's fine. That's fine. Well, I mean, why? Okay, that might be a sidetrack, but I have to ask, like, why do you dislike that word?
Because people use it all the time to say, oh, I pray to the universe, or I pray to, this goddess named.
Yeah, but what do they really mean when they say those things? Like, I'm like setting aside whether they're like correct in some objective sense or not. Like, what do they really mean when they say those things?
Well, what they really mean is they know that there has to be something outside themselves.
Right. So it's still like, so even though it's like, maybe it's like, maybe it's not the best way of understanding things, it's still like moving in the right direction.
You
It's
think
still
so?
certainly,
I almost think
it's still certain, being what?
being inoculated.
Inoculated. Oh,
Yes,
interesting.
it sort of makes you impervious for a long time anyway. It makes you impervious to the truth.
What part of the
I think
truth
you have that problem all the time, right? Because as you progress
Yeah.
towards the truth, you're always going to be met with things ever more close to the truth that aren't the truth. So you can always say that can be a stumbling block if you choose to rest at any given point along that path.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it was C.S. Lewis who said, we won't be able, if we could actually get people back to sort of a pagan view of the world, it would actually be able to we could convert people more easily, because in some sense, like we've lost a sense, like there's just this kind of deadness.
Yeah.
In terms of and even when we want to, even people that say they kind of want to believe there's a real struggle there, right? So I think there is something that's accomplished by becoming alive to the possibilities of anything beyond the sensible world.
I think I thank you, Michael, because that just made me think about one of the reasons that the word spirituality bothers me. And when people say they pray to the universe, it's because people want to have this sense in which everything is boundaryless. They don't want any boundaries. They don't want any edges between things. And so when they say, oh, I pray to the universe, that's just like this wide open thing. So there's no necessity for relationship. There's no necessity for individual communication.
There's no necessity.
Yeah, there's no necessity.
So what's wrong with it is that it's a denial. It's still a denial of one's own contingency. However, I still think there are.
Explain that. Explain that.
Okay.
There are a lot of people who may not understand what that means.
Sure. So basically, okay. So you have basically a few options. Like, you can either like attempt to like bear your own existential burden on your own, and like attempt to like understand like why it is you exist at all, how you exist at all. You can try to understand these things like either on your own terms, or and when you attempt to do that, like if you seriously confront those things honestly, you'll realize that like there's nothing about you that's necessary. Like you do not, the fact of your existence is not something that is required. Like, if you did not exist, like the universe would go on without you.
Now you're starting to sound like Lawrence Krauss.
Yes. Which is why I like this. I actually like that, like Lawrence, like this is the good part of what Lawrence is pointing at. Like Lawrence has this deep understanding how all of creation is fully contingent. The entire universe is contingent. And this is actually fundamentally correct. But the thing is, that leaves him with no, it really, he thinks he has an explanation for why the universe persists in existing, without any necessary ground. But the fact that the universe goes on existing despite that contingency is a question that demands an answer, which I don't think he has.
Okay, I think I must be misunderstanding the word contingent. I'm kind of upside down in my head, because I thought when if I say I'm contingent, then that means I wouldn't be here if there wasn't something before me that made it possible.
Well, not necessarily have to do with, it doesn't even necessarily have to do, like thinking about it in terms of connection to chronology is not even right. It's like if in any moment.
Right, it doesn't have to be in terms of time. I understand.
Right, exactly.
If I'm sitting on a chair, the chair is also composed of something, and the chair is sitting on something, and the thing that the chair is sitting on is something.
Right. At no moment can anything in the universe account for its own existence.
Yes.
It's like it's it screams for an explanation, because everything that we see that exists is contingent. And this is the part of what Krauss is saying that is right. What's interesting to me is when he says in some way it is an illusion, it really is an illusion. It's like the thought that popped into my head was like, what's the difference between a vision and an illusion? And why does he deny that our consciousness plays any part in that? So what I'm going to argue is that what he's pointing at actually is the actual contingency of all of the physical material created reality. So he's pointing at how materiality is itself fully contingent. But we have this stubborn consciousness that refuses to be explained away, that continues to exist alongside this contingent material universe. What is the source of that?
Well, I want to hear what Michael has to say. I'm
curious, Nate, what you think about this. I've been thinking about this idea of contingency, and I'm wondering if the perspective of contingency is one of kind of pre-creation. And I kind of have this speculative view. I feel like we've kind of talked about this before in different ways, but like this is just giving me a new lens for exploring it. That it's almost like God puts all his chips on the table with the universe in some respect, with the creative act, such that in some sense, and this is completely heretical, but I'm just going to say it anyway. In some sense, there's like a flip in a certain sense where not that God is contingent, but that somehow we become very vital parts of the story, and we also get real authorial impacts on how the story plays out. And that and part of what has fueled this for me, like, is us reading that M.L. Bach book, where there's something about when he talks about God trusting man that really just jumped out at me, that made me kind of go down this path. Again, I think this is speculative, and I think it's like it's still another, like, it's like some side of the same coin, right? I don't disagree with anything you're putting forward, but I feel like there's this sort of flip that happens with creation, and specifically the cross.
Right. Well, I would say incarnation. I would say what you're talking about, like, you've just explained what the meaning of the incarnation is. The meaning of the incarnation is he came down. Like,
but the other thing what Emil Bach points out is that in some sense, the lamb slain before the foundation of the world is the creation story.
Correct.
Right? Revelation chapter 4.
That's right.
So it's kind of vitally bound up in the creative act itself. Like, even though, so again, it's not plan B. It's
because the act of creation and the act of incarnation and the act of the descent into hell and the resurrection are all motion. They're all the same motion. They are all motions of infinite self-emptying love. That's how creation happens. That's how the incarnation happens. That's how the resurrection happens. And in the resurrection, it's going all the way down to the like the ground of being itself is entering into the depths of privation and non-being fully, which is what hell is.
I want to throw something in here. I was re-listening to Byrne Power's thing on Owen Barfield's final participation, which is an excellent talk. And one of the things he brought up is Hans Ruckmarker when he says, we see what we know. And I don't exactly know what Hans Ruckmarker meant when he said that, but I know that what exploded in my head was, oh yeah, because that goes all the way to particle physics and observations and all those things, but it also goes all the way to this idea of knowing and loving, and that knowing, true knowing, is this move of love. And when you see as an artist, you are seeing the potential that's there. You're seeing the beauty that can be realized onto the canvas. But it's not only going to be on the canvas, it's also going to be realized in the hearts and minds of the people who view it afterwards, right? So, but you see what you know. You can't truly see something unless you love it all the way down to the depths. And here I want to read this quote from Roger Penrose, who, I can't remember the name of his book. He wrote a book, probably wrote a lot of books, but this is in this one book. He says, according to quantum mechanics, any two electrons must necessarily be completely identical. And the same holds for any two protons and for any two particles, whatever, of any one particular kind. This is not merely to say that there is no way of telling the particles apart. The statement is considerably stronger than that. If an electron in a person's brain were to be exchanged with an electron in a brick, then the state of the system would be exactly the same state as it was before, not merely indistinguishable from it. The same holds for protons and for any other kind of particle, and for whole atoms, molecules, etc. If the entire material content of a person were to be exchanged with corresponding particles in the bricks of his house, then in a strong sense, nothing would have happened whatsoever. What distinguishes the person from his house is the pattern of how his constituents are arranged, not the individuality of the constituents themselves. So my question that springs out of that, obviously, where does that pattern come from? That pattern, I mean, this is why we're contingent, because we're made of, Lawrence Krauss talks about how we're made of particles that were created in the stars. In many ways, maybe the atoms that I'm carrying around right now are atoms that were being carried around by some bricks, 1,000 years ago. Maybe I'm part of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, who knows? But my pattern is different, and that pattern comes. To go to Michael's comment, I think that pattern comes from more than one place. The pattern comes from, I was knit together in my mother's womb by God. So that's a part of my pattern, but there's also this element of trust that allows my pattern to gather. This is the other thing, there was something that Matthew Allison said on one of my videos. He made this comment about seeing is gathering. So in the sense of, I think of it in the sense of curating. My life is curated by what I see. And what I see is basically curated by what I know. Now, obviously, if all I ever see is sitting down watching video games or television, my vision is severely curated down to something where there's very little potential for love. But if my seeing is reciprocally opened, and if I'm indwelt by the Spirit so that I can love the things that I'm seeing and knowing, then that's also writing onto my pattern, so that my pattern is made up of what I was born with and then what I experience in life. And then it's made up of the effect that other people have on me and the effect that I have on other people. All of those things are written into my pattern, and also the pattern of the body, the whole body of Christ, as we're all knit together, fit together as living stones, So
yeah, and all those threads are interwoven into a web. That's 100% agree with that. Also, like I think if keep that idea of both pattern and indwelling in mind when looking at, like, when trying to parse what Peterson was saying in that statement. Because I think that what he's trying to express with the analogy of the holographic, I think it has to do with understanding us as being more of a pattern. So it's a move away from because the holographic, that represents like whatever you are as an individual, right? Although the reason I object to the word individual, by the way, is that individual like suggests that you're not dividable, but really you are. You're very dividable. But in any case, so that it's the pattern that is you, right? So, and he uses the idea of holographic, and the holographic also suggests, like, to me, it kind of harkens back to like the uncreated light in some way. So he's like, to me, he's like, it's almost as if he's talking about, like, he's not talking about you like as you are now in your material embodied existence. He's talking about the eternal you. He's talking about like your body of light that is connected to the uncreated light. That is the pattern of you.
That's quite a leap. You're saying you think Peterson was thinking about that?
I don't know. I think that's what I think. He's obviously using holographic there and that as an analogy, right? He doesn't literally mean that you're like that we're like a holographic projection. I don't think he's a simulation theory guy, right?
Oh, well, no, but I think you might be extrapolating a lot more meaning into the word holographic than was the original, I mean, just basic meaning of it. Of course, it's been, as John would say, it's been accepted to be used for other things, but I think the original meaning of it is just that the whole is in the part.
So he's using it in terms of like
I don't know
just as a whole part relation.
I don't know how.
Yeah, I mean,
because there's that, yeah. And then there's also the whole thing about that if we're a holographic universe, then all of the information of what's in the universe would actually fit on the surface of the outside of the sphere of the universe, or he could be using it in sense of the holographic thing about all of the information that's in a black hole of whatever is in a black hole is resting on the surface of the event horizon of the black hole, and
which is
Michael has a few other means of holographic, because
what do you think he means there?
The lensing, the holographic lensing. Why did you use that word lens?
That's what I want to know.
Well, I think your reference to the uncreated light, I think that's warranted. I mean, broadly speaking, I think it's a data compression reference of, as Karen was alluding to, like the part having the whole somehow in it, even though that doesn't, quantitatively doesn't make sense. There's some way in which, because of these networks of connection and just the way, and I know this, we were going to talk about you guys were going to talk about the Trinity, and there's something about the way the human is aligned such that it models that in such a way that it is like a little version of that, and such. That's of course how Peter gets to the idea that each human consciousness is a center of the universe, not the center, but a center. And the depths of what that mean, I don't think we're really in touch with that. There was a quote
I forgot that he said that.
Which?
That each human consciousness is the center of the universe.
Yeah. And he put the emphasis on a center, not the, but there was this writer, he's a South American, Borges, and he said this, whatever one man does, it is as if all men did it. For that reason, it is not unfair that one disobedience in a garden should contaminate all humanity. For that reason, it is not unjust that the crucifixion of a single Jew should be sufficient to save it. And I think what's hidden in that is just there's just these vast ramifications for what we're doing because of because of these sort of network effects in what you were just describing there. And I think one of the things that comes out of this that I see is just how much more powerful the light is over the dark, so that you can have this kind of overwhelming sensation of the dark kind of having won the day. And what's funny is that in that really dark room, the tiniest little light suddenly is super bright and can win the day. And so there's something going on there where, I don't know, it's about you know,
Well, the dark reveals the light, doesn't it?
there's something about redemption there, where it just seems like, I don't know, it feels like, again, our notion of power and how we conceptualize things would seem to stack the odds against these sort of events happening. And Peterson is kind of in touch with this too, even just looking at, talking about just the evolutionary track of history, right? Because he's saying he's like all these, like this complexification and these things, they're not random. It doesn't, and mathematically, I don't think you can make a case for this to have that the information present in a human and all the processes that preceded it could have taken place randomly. I think the mathematical argument is just can't be made rationally. And I don't think there's any, I've never seen a serious attempt to try and do it. Anytime I've seen any hard data in that area, it seems very unlikely in the extreme. And the only way you get away from that unlikelihood is to posit much longer time horizon for the universe, or to throw it into another court of, positing a multiverse where, we just happen to be in the one universe out of the, trillions and trillions that was able to magically walk this path. Mm-hmm. But it's just not compelling. So I think, Peterson,
well, I think mathematicians have because conceptually it's so necessary for what they do. I think mathematicians have a tendency to trivialize the infinite, and to not realize that the infinite itself is an apophatic term, and you actually have no idea what you're talking about when you talk about the infinite. Definitely. Because they act as if they understand what they're talking about when they obviously don't. They couldn't possibly, by definition, because the infinite is just the not finite.
Yeah. So there's something going on there, and I think I think that's what Peterson is gesturing towards. It's like he's getting to a sort of apophatic view of God, right? He's like saying, yes, there's something, like we have to point to something to explain this stuff, right? We can see this pattern existing, showing up over and over and over and over again, and it has to come from somewhere.
He expresses that the relationship is kenotic. Now that's the part where now I think I understand. The holographic bit confused me. I wasn't sure what he was getting at, and that I'm like, maybe I might have overreached trying to understand what he possibly meant by that. But if he just means then it sounds to me like, based on what I'm hearing both of you saying, that basically what he's doing is he's using holographic to express the idea of being created in the image of, right, of being an icon.
Yeah, but I think you were onto something though, with in a certain sense, that saying there's something that's currently shining through us, because a hologram comes into being. It's by the act of the shining through. It is this representation of a pattern, and the pattern comes into its full representation by that shining through. And I think that's what he's saying.
I think, and like Peterson says some strange things in this conversation. So definitely there's some things slipping out of his subconscious, and his subconscious was definitely working overtime in this conversation. And maybe at some level, what I'm suggesting was operating within Peterson's subconscious. I just don't want to put that into his conscious articulation if that's not what he meant. But I'm saying that symbolically what he was saying can't point toward what I was talking about.
Well, yeah, I mean, when he connects it with the revelatory thought, I mean, there is at least metaphorical idea of light there, right? Yes. And then later on, they start talking about the insight experience, And that is certainly an input of light, or, yeah, that kind of thing. Well, and we did promise our viewers that we were going to talk about the Trinity. and they do come up with many ways of representing the Trinity here. And so maybe we should just, the very next thing that they say after this holographic thing, John Vervaeke goes from this amazing picture that Jordan Peterson has just drawn of the kenotic, holographic, all that kind of stuff. And then John says, oh, that's deeply convergent with the cog psi that I'm bringing into it. I just find that really funny. I don't know why. The idea here is that distributed cognition has a property, collective intelligence, that is not just the sum of individual intelligences. There's something more going on than just the collective intelligence, or that collective intelligence itself is more than just the sum of all the individual ones. And Jordan Peterson says, you can imagine it's like reading a book. I have this distributed spirit in my head plus my own experience. So I'm the combination of that distributed spirit and my own. So that's probably what the sun is in the Trinitarian combination, because that's an incarnation of the spirit in a particular time and place. That's what I bring to the dialogue. And that's when they start playing with that. And they start looking at maybe he got it wrong when he said the sun, but that is where he brings in the Trinitarian. So that's why we're talking about that today.
Right.
Any comments on that before we go on with the script?
Hold on a second. I made some notes about that portion.
I think the link to language is really key, because which is why the books come into play, because there is, as we're going through Barfield's speaker's meaning, there's this interplay between the lexical and the speaker's meaning, or you could say between the letter and the spirit, and there's something going on there that allows for this huge expansion of possibility, and is related to this idea of non-identical repetition that I think is kind of through and through all this conversation. It's kind of the background for everything we're talking about.
Yeah, when he brought up that book reading thing too, I thought of I couldn't help but think of Barfield too, and I think he's I don't know how he's tying that to the sun exactly. I'm not sure why that suggests the sun to him. But what he's talking about is about how how we're engaged in a participatory way in the meaning making process. Like that I can see how that relates to the sun. I'm not sure. I thought his better way of talking about the sun came later.
The way I think why he thought that was the sun rather than the spirit is that the distributed spirit is pouring into me and then connecting with my experience. So the heaven and earth.
Oh, right. So it's so it's unity with the body of Christ through the spirit.
Yeah.
Okay, now I get it. Yes.
Yeah. And so and we see this with all the members of the Trinity, right? That both of the other members of the Trinity are seen in each member of the Trinity.
Right.
So yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So now okay.
Just seeing a part of what he had a vision.
And it's in that relation that, so it's like in that relation, like with this, it's like in that relation with the Father through the Spirit that the Christ within us is born within like that feminine space that we have to create it. Like we all kind of we all need to imitate Mary too, not just Jesus, right? We need to be able to generate within us this like feminine space that is able to say, that is able to accept its own contingency and to say let it be, and allow the image of Christ within us to be born. And I think actually I didn't see that until you explained it the way you did. And now I see
Sophia right now.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly it. And what's funny actually, that bit about when I emailed John asked me to email him because I had some critique of like of what I experienced in the Q&A on his Discord server. And like that actual, like that image of like how like the reason that philonikeia and propositions are a problem is that they can interfere with the creation of that kind of like feminine space that we need to create in order for that to happen. I use that exact phrase of like, we need to create within us a feminine space that is a womb in which for the Son of God to be reborn within us. So,
but here's what I had written in my notes when I was thinking about that is Christ as fully God and fully man, but also now we have the work of the Spirit in us, pointing us to Christ, pointing us to this aspect of revelatory thought and how it is uniquely received by each one of us based on our experience and this network of thought connections that reside within us. But when he was thinking about Christ there, when he was thinking that was an image of Christ, I'm sure he was thinking of the distributed cognition as being God the Father, well, God, and then in the personal experience is the man. So the God and the man together make the Son.
right.
But so he wasn't thinking about I always think of the distributed cognition thing as being the Spirit working in us, because that seems,
I think so.
works
Yeah.
in Bible study. If each person is bringing to bear the things that they're learning from the Lord through the word and through their experiences in life, then we get a much fuller picture of the depth of meaning of what we're learning. So that's
And the Spirit's role is always to point towards Christ and
Yeah.
to make him attractive. And there is a feminine aspect to it, because it is a sort of preparation of the body and of that the bride status.
Mhm.
One thing I think about is that there's something about the Christ, the Logos, that is integrally related to creation. So that's why it becomes very important that it becomes this, that we think about the incarnation in particular time and a place. But and we see that, and which is why we can see Christ likeness, these images of Christ show up in different places. But there's also something in a way that it connects to all of creation. So the way I see of Christ is he's sort of this mediation point between sort of like the matter in the spiritual, the relationships, like the patterns, like it's like he is that, because there's all these, in Colossians, like he's kind of the thing in which all these things hold together, right? So it's this mediation, and it's that mediation between the truth in the service of love, or however they formulate it. But there's a quote at the end of Barfield's Speaker's Meaning, chapter 1, that kind of where he's talking about this idea of polarity and just how hard that is for people to understand. And I think it kind of maps well onto something like the Logos. So he talks about, a paradox is the violent union of two opposites that simply contradict each other, so that reason assures us we can have one or the other, but not both at the same time. And then he contrasts this, whereas polar contraries, as illustrated by the use of the term in electricity, exist by virtue of each other as well as at each other's expense. For that very reason, the concept of polarity cannot be subsumed under the logical principle of identity. In fact, it is not really a logical concept at all, but one which requires an active imagination to grasp it. Coleridge applied to it such terms as quote unquote projective unity and separative projection. Unlike the logical principles of identity and contradiction, it is only a form of thought. It is not only a form of thought, but also the form of life. It could perhaps be called the principle of seminal identity. It is also the formal principle which underlines meaning itself and the expansion of meaning. So there's so much in that, right? But
Yeah.
it's this mediation between these two things is what we're talking about in the Son, and that is what makes this meaning possible in finite forms, right? So that's that holographic thing where somehow the infinite gets lensed and has real particular instances in very finite space and time that we all witness everywhere, and it's the Spirit that is drawing our attention to it and allowing us to recognize it.
Right. And it's like, and I can't remember which of there was one of the, and I'm not going to get the quote right. And I can't remember who it's attributed to, but there was an Orthodox saint who like, we tend to have, we tend to think of like, we know like, if we're, I mean, if we're like Christians, like we understand that we're created in the image of God, that we are icons of God, but we tend to lose sight of the fact that so is all of creation, but to a lesser degree, right? So like there was this Orthodox saint who like he said that, I when I see a rock, I see an icon. When I see the grass, I see an icon. So it's like the entirety of creation is also an icon of God. It's not just us. So like there's a way that image is in every particular.
Well, yeah, and especially if you really see, one of the things I was doing when I got ready for my talk on Saturday was just reflecting on what there is in a tree. If you really see a tree, if you want to get to know a tree, what is there? And I ended up with probably 2 pages of material just about a tree and what a tree can be. And I ended up leaving out half of it when I gave my talk because I started running overtime, so I'm peeling stuff off. But even you just look at the particles of a tree and what it's made up of, and then the science of how a tree works. And even that's amazing. But then you think about the roots going down and the branches going up, and you think about the fractal nature of the tree, and you think about the tree as the purpose of the tree is to give shade, is to make a place for the birds in the branches. It's, all the leaves of the tree show us multiplicity and the unity of the tree. You can go on and on. I mean, you could go on forever talking about a tree, and it's all the principles that make up the universe. And it's like this icon through which you can see every aspect of the truth of God just in a tree. But you can do the same thing with a rock. You can do the same thing with a bird.
Right. And it's right. And it quickly becomes maybe not quantitatively infinite, but qualitatively infinite.
Yeah.
And that's like, which is why, I mean, just really quickly, as long as we're talking, as we're kind of vaguely talking about the Trinity, it's like, I think like
that's our purpose. That's our telos.
I think one of the reasons that people get hung up on the Trinity is they're thinking of it in quantitative terms. It's like, well, how can that which is 1 quantitatively also be 3 quantitatively? You have a paradox, but it's not talking about quantity. God is infinite. And as I tried to indicate before, like the infinite is not a quantity, it is beyond quantity. And as much as it's qualitative, it is also like beyond quality. So like it remains a mystery for sure, no doubt about it. Like, but it is important to understand that it is a qualitatively oneness and threeness, which can be a mystery but not a paradox. Right? Because it's a mystery but not a logical paradox. They're not the same thing. So because you're not positing a quantitative oneness and a positive threeness. They're qualitative. God has the quality of oneness and the quality of threeness. And I think that the reason that is because, well, like Peterson said something in this conversation, which I just want to bring up right now because it relates directly to the way I conceive of the Trinity. He says that love is the foundation of reality. And then he also suggests that the truth is the servant of reality. And to me, that's like, wow, you can't come up with a better metaphorical, analogical understanding of what the relationship between the Son and the Father is than that. Because the Son is the Son as the Logos is like, this like is that which reveals like the Father, the ground of reality, love in its fullness. And yet at the same time is of the same nature of it, because what is fully and actually true is also fully and actually real. So it shows you how it is also of a same nature with the Father at the same time.
Well, and when you said quality of oneness and quality of threeness, we are made in his image. And I mean, the only reason I am one is because he's holding me together, but I have this quality of oneness, all of these disparate particles and everything that make up me, and all of my disparate thoughts, and all of the ways that my personality has been projected out into the world, but then projected back into me, so that I have this quality of oneness. But I also have this quality of threeness, because I am mind, will, and emotions. I am body, soul, and spirit. You know, I have all these qualities of threeness that exist in me at the same time. And
yet you're a unity.
And yet I'm a unity. Right. And the whole universe is like that. I mean,
and that entire, and it is, and that unity, and let's say, so both that oneness and that threeness are bound up in relation. Like it's like, that's what makes everything cohere.
Yep. Let's just read a little bit of the script as we go on here, where he starts getting into the Trinity. He says, so then Jordan says, after he says that the son is like this idea of a person receiving the knowledge from a book, is not just it's all of the books that have ever been written dumped into him, connected to his experience, is like the son. Then he says, so we've got the Father as that distributed entity that stretches back in time, which you attributed to this idea of memory, right? And then Vervaeke says, no, let's try something to see if it maps in. People start to realize the presence of the collected intelligence beyond the presence of Tom and Sue and Anne. And then they start to enter into a relationship with that, with the presence of the collected intelligence. And then a further thing happens, which he didn't get to talk about because Peterson interrupted him. Peterson says, so maybe that's the spirit that is inhabiting everybody at that time. So it's akin to the Son and it's akin to the Father, but it constitutes that distributed space. Now, Michael and I have talked about this a lot, how there's the polarity also has this third thing that's the distributed space, that there's always a polarity between what appears to be a binary, but then there's a third thing that makes up this distributed space, or the relational thing. So that's kind of what I heard him saying there. And then Vervaeke says, well, I think of it as the Neoplatonic one. And Peterson says, that's your peculiarity, John. And Vervaeke comes back to, well, we'll come back to why I think that language is helpful, not exclusive. And Peterson says, well, yeah, it's helpful. And Vervaeke says, these people get to a place where they're doing the circling. Many of them are happy with what you might call the psychological intimacy. And then some people move on to logos intimacy. And then some people move through that, and by means of it, to an intimacy of what is the fount of that? What is the ground of that? What is it about reality? So right there, Vervaeke has created a trinity, right? The psychological intimacy, the logos intimacy, and then what is beyond that intimacy. So
it's Father, Son, and Spirit. Like the spirit is that's what's operating within the spirit, is what's operating within the group intimacy. And then the logos is like, that's the son that they're looking at, that is like that. And then they're passing through that, like through the son. Like the route is through the son to the Father. Like that's the reality, which he doesn't disagree with Peterson when Peterson posits like love is the actual like fundamental nature of reality. Mm-hmm. So it's like you have people engaging in a positive relational way under the inspiration and vision of the logos, which connects them directly to God the Father. It's a Trinitarian operation.
Yeah. So I have something I want to say about that, but Michael, did you want to add something to that?
No, I think that's great. I think so just to my own particular lens, in case it's helpful for anybody. There's something about the spirit that's kind of ineffable, like it's feminine, like what Nate was referring to, but it's something that's, you definitely feel it, right? And again, it directs your attention. and it directs your attention towards Christ, which again is the incarnation. And that incarnation can be literally anything you look at and keep at looking with this loving gaze. It reveals the presence of the logos there. But then, and that, and in some sense, the logos is always what gives us something that we can kind of hang our hats on temporarily and bring into some sort of propositional form that we can potentially share, right, and talk about. And because whatever the Spirit's doing is always has this kind of mysterious ineffableness to it. But then what Jesus says his mission is, right, is to reveal the Father, which is, again, so for me, again, the cross is about revealing that fount of kenotic love, which is, it is the essence. It is what upholds everything. And it is sort of the most hidden thing. Like there's something about the humility of God that leaves this so hidden below all these layers of beauty and all these other things. And there is something about like what they're describing in this process where you continue and continue and continue and kind of find yourself at the thing itself, which is this just, overwhelming love.
Right. It's interesting. Oh, go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, I was going to say, when we were tying this all back together again with the holographic thing, I just wanted to say that this idea of looking holographically at things and seeing the whole in the thing is something that requires is a strong word, but I mean, I think it's true, requires everyone's participation. Mm-hmm. Because without everyone participating in that, we never get the fullness.
That's why he also connects it to the kenotic, Karen, because that's like, he's like that it can only happen. Like the reason he says kenotic is like, you have to imitate the same motion that you have to imitate the Christ pattern. Like you have to imitate that same motion. It's like you have to let go of self-determination and leave no room for anything except for being filled with the fullness of that love that is the ground of being.
Well, see, to me, that's a picture of that is the picture of the work of the artist or of any maker. I mean, maybe this is, the makers in the Middle Ages. That's why people had such beautiful things just to use in their house, because the makers had this thing where the love of the Father is flowing through them and connecting up with all of their individual unique aspects and then flowing out into the piece that they're making, so that all of the beautiful uniqueness and complexity that God has crafted into each person gets moved out again into the whole, so that when we see these things, we're seeing the whole thing, not just part of it. So if people withhold their creative impulse and don't participate in that action of creativity, you see this today with a lot of young people saying, "Oh, I'm never going to have children." Almost all the young people today are saying, "I'm never going to have children." And many of them are saying, because I see myself and I see what a ditz I am, and I see what a problem I am and how much I'm damaging the earth. And why would I want to bring any people and why would I want to put up with the burden of taking care of somebody like me? And so they're withholding their creative potential. If you withhold your artistic potential or however you show that, whether it's with cooking or writing or community, just having relationship with people, that creative expression, everybody is supposed to participate. So we have the fullness, right?
Right. No, Karen, that's wonderful. And I'm so glad you talked about it in the language of potential, because okay, so like Peterson's talking about this idea of like the ground of reality being love. And then there's this talk about like this sort of like, this Trinitarian motion through the dialogos of like moving, people toward that, like by being in the Spirit and moving through the image of Christ back toward God the Father. And then like when you talk about it in terms of potential, like, so this makes me think of like, so obviously we have this idea of the ground of reality of love and God being love, but thinking about it in terms of like, Aquinas's language, for Aquinas, like God is pure act, right? So God is that which it's God that actuates the potential in all things. So when when you are imitating that motion, and when you're doing your art, whether if you're Jonathan Pajot and you're an icon carver, and you're like you're bringing through love, you're bringing the potency out of your raw materials, and creating something beautiful out of it. And that's an imitation of that's imitation of the divine action. When you're doing your painting of the same thing, and we can actually, the thing is, here's the thing, is like we can do this toward everything. We can be in this state toward everything in the creation, and it helps to elevate it all. And in doing that, we're elevating everything and offering it up toward God.
Yes, because we see what we know. And what you see actually, and I don't mean this in the woo-woo sense, but what you see is what gets realized. What becomes real is what you see. So, right. But
this is why Barfield is so worried about like what's indicated by these sort of like really weird artistic images. It's like,
yes,
like he's Barfield's very consciously aware of this being how reality works, and it's like, be careful what you're bringing into the world.
Yes, I mean the old children's song, "Be careful, little eyes, what you see."
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Very, very true. I mean, these are not trivial things that our children learn. You know.
No.
And two, I think at some points too. Critique as such has been confused for a creative act, and I do, you know,
that is so good. That is so good, Michael. Really, but please, I just had to say, please continue.
Yeah. But like, you know, like I think that's why, you know, Peterson always strolls back into some of the politics stuff, and I think he'd be better left to leave some of it aside. But I think there's a reason why he keeps stumbling back into it, because there's something like about this critique. There's something necessary about the postmodern lens, but it can be a good corrective to the, you know, the worst portions of modernity. But it also is this kind of thing you can get trapped in, and it's like this self-referential cycle that is nothing but critique, but puts itself forward as if it's some sort of creative enterprise, and people latch onto it. And it's a very easy creative enterprise because it has very simple rules, and you don't have to be especially bright or gifted, or you don't have to be especially vulnerable, because you're pointing out there, you're not really bringing something inside out and like being vulnerable.
But even at its best, all that critique can be is an imitation. It can't actually create anything.
Well, the simplest example that came to my mind is the guy who sits at the football stadium with his beer and his peanuts, and he's going, "Look at that guy, he just did that wrong." He hasn't created
right. Yeah. Right.
Thing, but he's got all the answers, you know.
Right. No, but right. Yeah. That's really good. Yeah.
That's the whole virtue signaling of the whole generation that is out there. Like Peterson talks about them out there on the street waving their signs, but they can't get their room clean, you know.
And I think maybe, and I wonder if there's somehow, Karen, if this isn't like tied up with like your negative reaction, like as an artist to the term spirituality, because maybe your problem with spirituality is that it's not paying close enough attention to what it seeks to create.
There's no consequences. There's no accountability to the universe. I mean, the universe gives you everything you ask for. And if you can conjure it up in your mind and think about it, the universe is going to realize it in front of you. But there's no connection. There's no accountability. There's no consequence. And so this is the whole thing. When they got,
you have a very particular sort of spirituality in mind when you say that, it sounds like. And maybe I was just taking it to mean like someone on a spiritual path of some kind, like, you know, whatever it is. And you seem to be thinking of like this particular sort of like postmodern like spirituality that kind of like is not part of any tradition, but just kind of takes whatever it wants from any tradition, you know, seemingly at random. And then okay. Yeah, I don't like that either.
But I mean, I would also prefer, I guess, to say, rather than to say that someone is on a spiritual path, I would rather say that someone is seeking truth.
Right.
Right? Because Christ is truth.
Right.
And so when you're seeking truth, whatever tradition you're coming from, if you're seeking truth, you're going to end up finding Christ.
Well, yeah, right. As well,
you might end up finding, some sort of spiritual feeling, but that's not going to be the same thing as finding truth.
Yeah, but I do think it. So I do
depends
think
on how you're pursuing truth, though.
Well, it's very possible you might come up with like some very wonky labels for what you're doing. Because I do think, and this is a problem with language in our time, where language has become, so many words have kind of become desiccated and dead in terms of their ability to point to something.
Mm-hmm.
And so people will pull all sorts of things off the shelf to gesture towards what they're doing. And I think there's some danger in that, but I don't know. I think it's kind of inevitable in the time we're in, where there's so much confusion. There's so much, even within the church, there's so much bad theology. There's so much of a desiccation of the richness of the language. And it's essentially, theological contents. I think, so I agree with you in terms of like, there's real risks there, but I see risks coming more from the other side of the kind of prosaic use of language beating the life and the spirituality out of all words. So like anytime I see somebody grasping for something more, however clumsily, I'm kind of encouraged rather than discouraged.
Did either of you read the Paul Kingsnorth piece on the machine and the cross?
No, but I will look it up.
Oh, you should. It's fantastic. You guys should both read it. But like part of his journey, like he had a very interesting spiritual journey, and he kind of passed through. It's interesting in a very modernist way. He kind of passed through. He kind of passed through like every possible way station on his way to eventually becoming an Orthodox Christian. But one of the pathways he passed through was witchcraft. And it's like, I do really think, I agree with Michael in that, to me, like the risk of living in the world of dead objects, of materialism, is actually a worse state to be in than at least like sensing there might be something more to reality than just this contingent material stuff. I think so. It's certainly not, it's not the fullness of the truth, but at least you're like looking in the right direction, which is like my daughter, like on a personal level, like my daughter, like who had been a materialist atheist, like came to me a couple months ago and is like, yeah, I'm like, I think I'm interested in Wicca. And I said, well, at least you're not a materialist anymore. That was my reaction. Like, I actually saw that as a positive step in her spiritual journey. I really did, like unironically. And I think she told me like thinking that she would get a reaction maybe, but my reaction was, you're moving in the right direction. Like, at least at least you're looking for something more than a world of dead objects now. So
there's a really deep truth there, because when I was a kid, I lived in Europe with my family because my dad was in the military. And when I was probably 8 years old, he came home with this trilogy of books that somebody had given him. Some guy he had met had given him these books that he had written. And I don't even know if the books actually exist or if this guy just had some vanity publisher publish his 3 books. I have no idea. But they were the history of witchcraft. And my dad had these books sitting around. And so I started reading them and I found it absolutely fascinating. Now, I had no religious tradition in my household, no teaching of any kind, didn't darken the door of a church until I was probably 13 or 14. And we had to go on Wednesdays after school to some kind of release time thing. And then I just learned the nuts and bolts of church history or something. I didn't really learn anything about Christ. But reading those books, as spooky as it was, did give me the impression that there is some spiritual reality out there that a person ought to take some note of and be cognizant.
Right.
And so then when I was in college and I'm hanging around with this girl that was her father was a shaman in the Indian tribe in North Dakota. And so she would have these like seances with us, And it wasn't until much later that I realized after I became a Christian, I realized that there was still something that had a grip on me. And it was through someone talking me through my past history and kind of discovering that I had been involved in these seances. And they prayed over me for this, and I could actually feel it. I mean, I know this sounds very woo, but I could feel something move from the soles of my feet up through my body and out the top of my head and gone. That may have just been a psychological response to some sort of release that I felt, that I was now released of this thing from, I have no idea what it was, but at least there was something.
We're both raised Assemblies of God. We're not gonna we're not gonna have any problem with that, Karen.
Anyway, yeah. So there was this idea in me, even as a young person, there's some sort of spiritual reality out there. And so maybe there is a sense in which that is more helpful than just being a pure materialist, because I never was a pure materialist. But the thing that led me to Christ was, and there are many different kinds of spirits. It was getting involved in some conspiracy theories, getting so deeply involved in conspiracy theories that I had filled my entire house with research about.
Oh, wow.
And had gotten so filled up with fear over it. And so, I mean, someday I'll tell the whole story, but that was the spirit that opened my eyes eventually, that there was some other truth.
Right.
So yeah, I guess there are many avenues, so I shouldn't be so nasty about spirituality.
No, I mean, I understand what you're critiquing there too, though. I mean, like there's something that it's like, first of all, it's really spoiled. I mean, just at a fundamental level to think that it's treating God as a consumer product, I think, in a way. To me, it's kind of like a build your own God, kind of like Build-A-Bear, but for a deity. It's like, I'll just select this portion from.
So isn't it also worshiping the creation rather than the creator? I mean, that's what it says in Romans 1, that
Yeah, I think it is, because it's like you're wanting to have God, but you're wanting it to find it on your terms. I actually think, ironically though, I think people, when they get overly propositionalist with their thinking, kind of end up making the same move. So it's like, what's interesting is like one path might be caused by like just operating like maybe too much of an intuition without any discernment, and the other might be like too much too much intellect without enough intuition. So it's like, and both kind of like, I think, are like lead one off course.
Isn't that the whole difficulty with marriage? If you can't get a balance between discernment and intuition in a marriage, you got real problems. Like,
right.
I happen to be very familiar with the masculine and feminine aspects of the hemispheres of the brain, because my husband has the total masculine hemisphere, and I have much more of there is some masculine in my thinking, but I'm mostly feminine, and then I have this little bit of masculine. But so he's all about discernment, and I'm all about intuition.
Right.
So we have to draw those together, otherwise
they have to be together.
Yeah,
right, they have to be together, because like here's the I can because it's all about discerning the spirits, because intuition really is like Emil Bach in the Apocalypse of St. John. He has this great way of putting it that like seemed counterintuitive to me at first, but then once I started thinking about it, it made total sense. He refers to intuition as a spiritual sense of touch, because if we think about how we talk about our intuition, they're always like, I felt this, I felt that, I was moved by this. I was like, there's like it is connected somehow to like a sense of feeling, it has a tactfulness to it, but in a spiritual mode. But the thing is, you also need discernment, because there are other spirits than the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, well, so you remember in the beginning of this conversation, these guys are talking, and Jordan Peterson starts telling the story from one of Tolkien's. He got it wrong. It wasn't Bilbo, it was actually Frodo.
Right.
He was feeling his way across the swamp step by step on the skulls of these dead people. but basically he's feeling his way across. And that was what the analogy Jordan Peterson was using to describe tracking. And so I was having this conversation with Mark Lefebvre the other day, and I said, what that made me think of when I heard that was something I had heard years ago in a Christian conference about when you're really trying to get to know somebody so that you can share Christ with them or share some truth with them. Really knowing them and listening to them is sort of like taking the edge of your thumb and rubbing it along the edge of their soul. And you can feel the scars. And it's in those scars where the opportunity for connection is, because you have your scars, they have their scars. And that's exactly what I hear you saying when you say intuition is this spiritual sense of touch. It's really another way of knowing, right?
Yeah, it is. That's right.
And that's how we know Christ, by the scars, right? And so
yeah. But at the same time, we do need discernment, because there are, like, I would say like that, like I would say that a lot of people who, like, let's say, get caught up in like political ideological movements, for example, like a lot of times, like, that's like they're real, typically they're not, I mean, sometimes they're doing it like in a completely intellectual way, but usually they're doing it more out of like an intuitive feeling of like that there's something in this that's like that's appealing to them. But that's like another sort of spirit, though. Not to mention, like, all the other sorts of spirits that might be, out there. I was like, someone was talking to me recently on the Discord server, and they asked me to, like, I had made the statement that, to me, like, that what the spirits that are not holy spirits, what they are is that they're anti-personal spirits, right? Because they tend to move us either toward like this extreme of individualism where we're locked in a prison of our own desires, right? Or they like move us in a direction where, like, we give ourselves up into some collective spirit that is not the Holy Spirit. Like and it does it takes us out of like this like balanced middle, like, personal space where we have like a very like relational understanding of our being.
that, earlier in the conversation when these guys are talking, they're talking, or maybe it's later, John starts talking about his relationship with his partner, and his idea of love is that she I should go get the quote, but anyway, it felt like that to me, that they're not enough discernment about, you can't give the whole of yourself to another person and they give the whole of themselves to you and not have any basically not have any differentiation or any boundary, because there still has to be the binary, there still has to be the masculine and the feminine. If you're both all the same, then you're losing the opportunity to know Christ. Because okay, so here's the hierarchy, and you have the husband and the wife, and in this case, they're partners. As each moves towards Christ, they draw closer together until they're at the top with Christ. They're in union with one another. But if they get into union with one another without Christ, then what they've done is use a shortcut to try to get that fullness and that wholeness, and they've lost the opportunity to have union with Christ. Does that make sense?
Well, I see what you're saying, and I made a note on when Vervaeke said that too, and I think let me pull up what he actually said. I don't know if it was this. This is something he said. I don't know if this was. I wrote this down. I don't know if it was in the context of talking about his relationship or not, but he was talking about like there being no clear separation between. I think he is actually talking about this in the idea when he's talking about conformity, where he says there's no clear separation between you knowing the thing and you knowing yourself,
Yeah, that's a different, I think that's a different thing.
Right. But I think that's
When he
why
was talking about
I
his
think
partner, he was talking about creating a space, like that, a space within yourself that has purchase in the other person, where it's the person can always come back and know that that space is there, and that space is dedicated in some sense to allowing that person both to be the individual that they are, but also to kind of grow into some fullness, right? Of their, whatever their potential is.
Yes, yes, but I'm not thinking about that part. Yeah,
Okay.
not the part I mean. There would.
I think we both missed the exact part you're talking about.
Yeah.
Like most of the things I heard Vervaeke say about love, I thought were like pretty spot on. And he seemed to be, and the part you're talking about, Michael, when you talked about the creation of space, like to me, like there's very much a sense of the kenotic in there, because that's like
Yeah.
anytime you're talking about creating space, that's a kenotic
Yeah,
notion.
I found that really moving. Like I felt like there was something there that's just really absent in our understanding of love right now. Because you're right, because it's not the masculine move. It's there's a patience there, and again, this idea of space, there's possibility, there's potential, and it's not locked down or defined. It's but it is, but at the same time, it's consistent, it's constant. The person can come back and have confidence that it's going to be there again.
It's preparing the soil for the mustard seed.
If I might cast it in the masculine feminine thing through a lens of art, which is just the way that I look at things. I talked a lot in my presentation about how dominance is an important aspect of art, that dominance is what brings unity. And one way to think of dominance is that dominance provides the foundation, or the support, or the bed upon which the focal point can sparkle, can be noticeable. So if I think of it that way, I think the husband and wife relationship, the husband provides the support and the strength to support the role of the feminine in being the everything that's involved there, the one who brings life and the beauty and the purity and all of those things. So the husband is this supporting structure. He risks everything. He lays down his life for her, as Christ does for the church. But then on the other side, the same thing is happening with the woman, because the feminine is to lay herself down and be the ground of being for this idea of life that comes into her, and then the fullness, is there through that.
You're using the word dominance, but then if you look at the language you used to actually talk about it, you're talking about dominance like in the terms of like proper lordship, right?
That's exactly right.
Where
yes.
it's like a where it's like a servant. It's like a servant mode. So that the move you're talking about is actually a move of mutual submission.
Exactly.
I think Vervaeke I think is talking about the same thing, and maybe just using language that threw you off. I actually think that's what he means.
The reason I came to that conclusion about dominance, because I was taught by my creativity teacher that dominance is what brings unity in a painting. And I had to think about it for a long time. Why is that? And when we talk about dominance in a painting, we talk about roughly 80% of the painting should be one thing, and 20% of it should be maybe 15% of something else, and then 5% of the thing that you really want people to look at. So the dominance has to be there, otherwise the focal point wouldn't be noticeable, because there'd just be everything all scattered and be all kinds of differentiation, and you wouldn't notice the thing that you want to notice. So there has to be a lot of something and a little bit of something else. And I started to realize that this lot of something is the one that lays down his life, right? But on the other
side, he's so a lot that he's in all things.
Yes, and also the universe is this vast, place, and then humanity is this little jewel case, and then also all of us are through the body of Christ. the body of Christ is sacrificed. We are all of us are the multiplicity, and he is the unity. So it works both ways. It works every way. Every way you look at it, it works. And
Right.
I just think and then the Pareto principle works its way out through everything, which is the 80%, 20%. So there's something very, very mysterious about this thing of dominance bringing unity. So in a marriage, there has to be, I think this is why the scripture says that you submit yourself to one another, and then wives submit yourself to Christ, because one person has to be responsible for the final decisions. Otherwise, final decisions don't get made. If it's all 50-50, it's contention constantly.
Right. Yeah. I think deciding is like really the right way to talk about it too, because like that's what that is. It's the spirit of making righteous decisions. Like that's I don't have a better way of talking about it. So yeah.
You know, I think I've said this before, but you know, the Chinese character for righteousness is made up of two smaller characters, one on top of each other. Some Chinese characters have 4 quadrants, some have 2. Well, righteousness, the bottom one is me.
Yeah.
The character for
Right. Yeah.
And
Yes. Yeah.
the top
Yeah.
one is the lamb.
Yeah. Oh my, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lamb over me is
Yeah.
righteousness.
Wow. That's a great, I think maybe that's a good note to end on right there. Because we could probably, like I said, this was 9 minutes of like
We
some
didn't
of the
get-
most.
We didn't get through 9 minutes. I think we only got through about 5. So maybe we have to pick it up another time.
I think we might have to do a part 2. Yeah. Oh, definitely.
And one other thing we didn't notice, but I mean, that this whole idea of the family or the male-female relationship also is pointing back to the Trinity as well, or at least in this idea of the family. There's something going on there as well.
Oh yeah. You've heard me talk about that a lot.
Yeah.
Maybe we could save that for next time. I could talk about like why the family is an image of a Trinity.
Well, the Trinity shows up everywhere. You know, I'd love to sit down and have a real conversation with Lawrence Krauss where he let go of some of his preconceptions and actually had an open mind about anything, because the Trinity shows up everywhere. And I'd also love to ask a guy like him, you know, what happened in your childhood? Because John Vervaeke says over and over again, basically he's saying one of the reasons it's hard for me to believe is because of the tenuous relationship I had with Christianity as a child.
Right.
And my father had that really bad relationship with Christianity as a child. So he didn't come to Christ until 3 months before he died.
Right.
Which meant that he, you know, his whole life could have been so much different. So
I'm so glad that you said that though, because like that's like okay, this is a really crazy thing to say at the end of the conversation, but that's like that's the important bit is that it's not just about like a lot of times like we like the way Christians tend to like talk about it, they like make it way too much about the eschaton, and they do not emphasize enough like how it is so much richer way of living right now. So yeah.
well, and that's the whole thing about seeing. The word says that the word is not seeable by natural eyes. You can only see the word if you are infilled with the Holy Spirit. So it cannot be understood with the natural mind, let me put it that way. But I mean, I always think of that through the lens of seeing. So yeah. So that's a good place to wrap it up, and we'll
All right. All
this
right, Karen, thanks for inviting me.
is like a roller coaster ride.
This was. Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Thank you guys very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Karen.